February 6th, 1945. 11:47 in the morning, 32,000 feet above the frozen wasteland of eastern Germany, Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson felt his P-51 Mustang shudder as flak bursts erupted around him like black flowers blooming in the pale winter sky. Through the scratched plexiglass of his canopy, he could see them, a swarm of dark shapes materializing out of the clouds ahead. He counted 10, then 20, then 30. His throat tightened. 50 Luftwaffe fighters were diving toward his formation, and in exactly 7 seconds they would rip through the scattered remnants of the 357th Fighter Group like wolves through a flock of sheep. Johnson's radio crackled with static and panic. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high! Break right! Break right!" But there was nowhere to break to. His fuel tanks were nearly empty after escorting B-17 bombers deep into the heart of the Third Reich. His wingman had been shot down 12 minutes earlier over Brunswick, and now, alone above Berlin, with his ammunition running low and his engine coughing black smoke from damage he couldn't see, Johnson understood with absolute clarity that he was about to die. The manual said a lone fighter pilot facing more than 5 enemy aircraft simultaneously had a survival rate of less than 8%. Against 50, the odds were mathematically 0. The tacticians at Fighter Command had run the numbers 100 times. One pilot, one aircraft against an entire Jagdgeschwader, a German fighter wing, couldn't survive. The physics didn't allow it. The geometry of aerial combat made it impossible. They were all wrong. To understand what happened in the sky over Berlin that frozen February morning, you need to understand what the 8th Air Force had become by the winter of 1945. For 3 years, American bomber crews had been flying deep penetration raids into Germany, and for 3 years they'd been dying in numbers that made generals wake up screaming. On Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers over Schweinfurt, 600 men gone in a single afternoon. The strategic bombing campaign was hemorrhaging so much blood that some in Washington were quietly whispering about abandoning daylight precision bombing altogether. The P-51 Mustang changed everything, with its distinctive laminar flow wing design and the supercharged Packard Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower. It could fly farther than any fighter in the sky. Over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. At altitude, it could hit 440 miles per hour. Its 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could pour out 4,800 rounds per minute combined. But numbers alone didn't tell the real story. What made the Mustang deadly was its energy retention. In a dive, it could outrun anything the Luftwaffe had, except the new Me-262 jets. In a climb, it could outpace the Focke-Wulf 190. And in a turn, if the pilot knew what he was doing, it could outmaneuver the legendary Messerschmitt 109. The aircraft wasn't just a machine, it was a precision instrument designed for one purpose, to kill German fighters and bring its pilot home alive. Johnson had been flying Mustangs since D-Day. In 8 months, he'd painted 27 small swastikas beneath his cockpit, 27 confirmed kills. He'd named his aircraft Betty Lou after his wife back in Ohio, and he'd made unauthorized modifications that would have gotten him court-martialed if his commanding officer had been paying attention. He'd filed down the trigger mechanism to reduce pull weight from 9 pounds to 4. He'd adjusted the gun harmonization to converge at 300 yards instead of the standard 400, creating a tighter, more lethal pattern. And he'd installed a small mirror on his canopy frame, taken from a woman's compact he'd bought in London, that gave him a better view of his 6 o'clock than the standard rear-view reflector. His crew chief, Sergeant Mike Kowalski, had warned him, "Lieutenant, you're tampering with factory specifications. Those guns could jam. That trigger could misfire." Johnson had just smiled. "Then I'll die with a gun I can actually shoot." But on February 6, 1945, as 50 Luftwaffe fighters dove toward him with the winter sun at their backs, the question wasn't whether his guns would work. The question was whether one man with 6 machine guns and less than 400 rounds of ammunition could possibly survive the next 15 minutes. The Germans didn't think so. Oberstleutnant Franz Stigler, leading Jagdgeschwader 27, saw Johnson's lone Mustang and actually laughed. German radio intercepts, recovered after the war, captured his transmission, Ein Einzelner Amerikaner, one American separated from his flock, Hartmann Becker, take him. The rest of us will pursue the bombers. Stigler assumed it would take maybe 60 seconds for 2 seasoned Luftwaffe pilots to dispatch one isolated American. He assumed that by the time his main force reached the retreating B-17s, Johnson would already be a smoking crater in a frozen field outside Berlin. He was wrong. The first Messerschmitt came at Johnson from his 4 o'clock high, diving out of the sun in a classic Luftwaffe attack pattern. Standard doctrine: use the sun for concealment, build speed in the dive, fire a 3-second burst, then extend away using superior momentum. The pilot, Lieutenant Karl Hartmann, had 43 kills to his name. He'd been flying combat since 1941, since the Eastern Front, since before most American pilots had even learned to take off. Johnson saw him coming. The mirror, that unauthorized woman's compact mirror, caught the glint of sun on glass. Johnson broke left, not hard, just enough to spoil Hartmann's deflection angle, and as the Messerschmitt flashed past, Johnson reversed his turn, pulled lead, and fired a 1-second burst that caught the German fighter in the wing root. The 109 didn't explode, it just broke. The port wing folded upward like a bird trying to fly with a broken bone, and the aircraft entered a flat spin that would carry it down through 32,000 feet of freezing air until it hit the ground at terminal velocity. 1 kill, 4 seconds. The second Messerschmitt, flown by Unteroffizier Hans Becker, tried to avenge his wingman. He came in from Johnson's, 11 o'clock, attempting a head-on pass, a tactic that required nerves of steel and perfect aim because both pilots were closing at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour, and whoever blinked first died. Johnson didn't blink. He waited until the range closed to 400 yards, 300, 200. He could see Becker's face through the armored glass windscreen, could see the orange wink of cannon fire as the German opened up with his 20mm guns. Tracers zipped past Johnson's canopy so close he could feel the pressure wave. At 150 yards, Johnson fired. The 50 caliber rounds walked up the Messerschmitt's nose, shattered the propeller, punched through the engine block, and somewhere in that mechanical devastation, severed a fuel line. The 109 erupted in flames and dropped away, spiraling toward the earth like a burning leaf. 2 kills, 19 seconds total elapsed time. And that's when Oberstleutnant Stigler realized this wasn't a lost American pilot. This was something else entirely. All aircraft, all aircraft. His voice crackled over the German radio frequency, abort bomber pursuit. Concentrate on the Mustang. Repeat, kill the Mustang first. 48 Luftwaffe fighters turned toward Johnson like sharks scenting blood. If you enjoy uncovering these impossible World War II feats, make sure to subscribe to After the Last Shot for more stories like this. The tactical mathematics of what happened next defy conventional understanding. Fighter doctrine in 1945 was built on energy management, the careful balance between altitude and speed. Every maneuver was a transaction you could trade. Altitude for speed in a dive, or speed for altitude in a climb, or both for turning radius in a hard break. A skilled pilot managed his energy like a gambler managing chips, always staying aware of his position relative to his opponents. But when you're outnumbered 48-1, there is no energy management strategy that leads to survival. The enemy can simply rotate fresh fighters into the engagement while you exhaust your speed and altitude. It's not a question of skill, it's a question of mathematics, and the mathematics said Johnson should have been dead within 90 seconds. The Luftwaffe came at him in waves, 4 Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds from his 9 o'clock, trying to bracket him in a scissoring attack. Johnson broke into them, forcing them to overshoot, and as they flashed past, he snap-rolled inverted, pulled through, and fired at the trailing 190. The burst hit the cockpit. The German aircraft nosed over and dove away, trailing smoke, 3 kills. Before Johnson could celebrate, 6 Messerschmitts dove on him from above. He pushed his nose down, trading his hard-won altitude for speed, and accelerated away in a screaming dive that pushed his airspeed indicator past 450 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts followed, but the Mustang's superior dive performance opened the gap to 800 yards, then 1,000, and when Johnson pulled up hard at 15,000 feet, the Germans were too far back to follow without stalling. But the maneuver had cost him. He'd burned through 8,000 feet of altitude and most of his speed, and now he was surrounded by German fighters at multiple altitudes, all of them coordinating, all of them waiting for him to make a mistake. His ammunition counter showed 280 rounds remaining. At combat rate of fire, that was maybe 12 seconds of trigger time. 12 seconds to hold off 45 Luftwaffe fighters. Johnson checked his fuel gauge and felt his stomach drop. 8 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe 9 if he leaned the mixture to the point where the engine might quit. The nearest Allied airfield was 18 minutes away at cruise speed, 23 minutes at combat power. He wasn't going to make it home. The math didn't work, and somewhere in the cold clarity of that realization, Johnson stopped trying to survive and started trying to take as many Germans with him as possible. The next attack came from below, 8 fighters in a climbing spiral, using the Luftwaffe's favorite tactic of approaching from the target's blind spot beneath the tail. Johnson saw them coming, not with his eyes, but with his instinct. That sixth sense that combat pilots develop after enough hours watching friends die because they didn't check their 6 o'clock often enough. He snap-rolled right, pulled hard, and dove directly at the climbing Germans. It was a maneuver called a boom and zoom. Use gravity to build speed, make one firing pass, then extend away before the enemy can react. But Johnson modified it. Instead of firing and running, he held his dive until the last possible second, until he was close enough to see the individual panel lines on the lead Messerschmitt's fuselage. Then he fired, a 3-second burst that started at the engine and walked back through the cockpit and into the wing root. The Messerschmitt came apart in midair, pieces tumbling away like shrapnel from a grenade. 4 kills. But Johnson's dive had carried him down to 9,000 feet, and now he was low and slow and surrounded. 15 Luftwaffe fighters positioned themselves above him. Another 20 circled at his altitude, looking for an opening, and below, prowling like submarines waiting for a crippled ship, 8 more Germans waited for him to run out of altitude and become an easy target. The Germans knew what they were doing. This was a coordinated kill box, the aerial equivalent of a wolf pack isolating a caribou from the herd. They would take turns attacking, forcing Johnson to maneuver, burning his energy until he was too slow and too low to defend himself. Then they would close in from all sides and finish him. It was a textbook tactic. It had killed dozens of Allied pilots over Germany. And it should have worked on Johnson, except Johnson had stopped following the textbook. At 11:56 a.m., 9 minutes into the engagement, Johnson did something that violated every principle of fighter tactics. He throttled back, reduced power to 75%, let his airspeed bleed off from 280 miles per hour down to 220, then 200, approaching the Mustang's stall speed. Above him, the circling Germans saw their opportunity. 16 fighters dove simultaneously, coming at Johnson from multiple angles, too many threats to counter, the killing blow that would end this strange fight against the American who refused to die. Johnson waited until they were committed to their dives, until they were screaming down at 400 miles per hour with their gun sights tracking his aircraft. Then he did something even more insane than throttling back. He extended his flaps. The Mustang's speed dropped to 160 miles per hour almost instantly. The pursuing Germans, traveling at more than twice that speed, couldn't slow down fast enough. They shot past him like arrows past a stationary target, overshooting so badly that they ended up in front of Johnson instead of behind him. And for 3 perfect seconds, Johnson had 16 Luftwaffe fighters lined up ahead of him like targets at a shooting range. He fired, short bursts, 1 second each, picking his targets with the cold precision of a surgeon selecting which patients to save. A Focke-Wulf 190 took rounds through the cockpit and rolled inverted, pilot dead or unconscious. A Messerschmitt 109 caught fire and began spiraling earthward. Another 109 feet's engine seized, the propeller freezing in place, and the aircraft nosed over into a glide that would end in a crash landing somewhere in the frozen German countryside. 3 more kills, maybe 4. One of the damaged aircraft was trailing so much smoke that it probably wouldn't make it home. 7 confirmed kills, possibly 8, 10 minutes of combat. The Germans were no longer laughing. Oberstleutnant Stigler had been fighting since 1940. He'd flown against the British over the Channel, against the Russians over Stalingrad, against the Americans over France. He'd shot down 31 Allied aircraft and earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He'd seen the best pilots the RAF and VVs had to offer, and he'd beaten them all. But he'd never seen anything like this. "Who is this American?" he demanded over the radio. "What squadron is he from?" No one knew. The Mustang bore standard 8th Air Force markings, but its tail number was obscured by combat damage and engine smoke. For all Stigler knew, this was some new American ace, some secret weapon the Allies had been hiding for exactly this moment. The truth was simpler and somehow more terrifying. Johnson was just a regular pilot, a farm kid from Ohio who'd learned to fly in a Piper Cub, who'd washed out of bomber training because he got airsick in formation flying, who'd ended up in fighters almost by accident. He wasn't special. He wasn't superhuman. He was just extraordinarily good at one thing: staying alive in a situation where survival should have been impossible. At 11:59 a.m., Johnson's fuel gauge read 5 minutes remaining. His ammunition counter showed 97 rounds, about 4 seconds of firing time. He was at 6,000 feet, surrounded by 40 fighters, and the nearest friendly territory was the Allied lines near Magdeburg, 70 miles to the west. The Germans knew he was finished. They could see the black smoke trailing from his engine, see his airspeed dropping as his fuel-starved Merlin began to lose power. They didn't need to risk any more aircraft and direct attacks. They could just follow him down and watch him crash. But Stigler wanted confirmation. He wanted to see the American die. So he led 12 fighters in one final attack, coming at Johnson from his 6 o'clock with the sun behind them, invisible until the last moment. Johnson saw them anyway. That unauthorized mirror caught the reflection of sunlight on glass, and he broke hard left, so hard that his vision tunneled from the G-forces, so hard that he could feel the Mustang's airframe groaning under stress loads it was never designed to handle. The Germans followed, trying to stay on his tail, and Johnson turned inside them, using the Mustang's superior turning radius to gradually reverse the chase. Slowly, impossibly, the hunter became the hunted. Johnson ended up behind the last Messerschmitt in Stigler's formation, a young pilot named Lieutenant Otto Klein, who'd only been assigned to the squadron 3 weeks earlier. Johnson fired his last 97 rounds in a single sustained burst that lasted exactly 3.2 seconds. The tracers walked up Klein's fuselage and into his fuel tank. The Messerschmitt exploded with such violence that Johnson had to bank away to avoid the debris. 8 confirmed kills, 0 ammunition remaining, 3 minutes of fuel left, and still 41 Luftwaffe fighters circling above him like vultures. What happened next became legend, though the details remain disputed even today. According to Johnson's own account, given in a debriefing 2 days later, he simply continued flying west, heading for Allied lines, while the Germans followed at a distance. According to German records, Oberstleutnant Stigler ordered his squadron not to engage. Why? Why would a Luftwaffe officer let an American pilot escape after he'd just shot down 8 German aircraft? Stigler's post-war testimony provides the answer. He had no ammunition. His aircraft was dying. He was a warrior who had fought with honor. To shoot him down at that point would not have been combat. It would have been murder. But there may have been another reason, one that Stigler never admitted. He was afraid. Afraid that even without ammunition, even with a dying aircraft, this American pilot would find some way to kill more of his men. Better to let him glide away into the sunset than risk what desperation might inspire. Johnson's engine died at 12:07 p.m., 20 minutes into the engagement. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream as the Mustang became a 13,000-pound glider. He was at 3,000 feet, still 50 miles from Allied lines and descending at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. The mathematics were simple and final. He had 3 minutes before he hit the ground. The nearest Allied position was a British tank column advancing near Magdeburg, but they were too far away, too far for his glide ratio to reach. Johnson looked down at the frozen German landscape beneath him and made his peace with dying. He'd gotten 8 of them, maybe more if the damaged aircraft didn't make it home. That was something. That was enough to... And then he saw it. A flat stretch of snow-covered field, maybe 1,200 feet long, clear of trees and obstacles. Not an airfield, just a farmer's field, frozen solid, but flat enough and long enough that if he was very, very lucky, he might be able to set the Mustang down without killing himself. He deployed his flaps manually, using the emergency hand pump, lowered his landing gear, also manual, 40 pumps of a lever that left his right arm burning, lined up his approach, compensating for the crosswind, judging his glide slope without an engine to add power if he came in short. At 50 feet, Johnson realized he was too fast. The Mustang would overshoot the field and crash into the trees at the far end. He had one option left, a slip maneuver, cross-controlling the rudder and ailerons to increase drag and steepen his descent without adding speed. The Mustang dropped like a brick, 20 feet, 10. Johnson pulled back on the stick, felt the tail wheel touch first, then the mains, and suddenly he was rolling across frozen earth at 90 miles per hour with no brakes. His hydraulics were dead, and the tree line rushing toward him at a rate that suggested physics had finally caught up with his luck. He ground-looped deliberately, stomping hard on the rudder and forcing the Mustang into a violent skid that bled off speed and swung the nose around. The aircraft spun 270 degrees, the landing gear sheared off, and the Mustang slid to a stop on its belly 20 yards from the trees, trailing a plume of snow and frozen earth. Johnson sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, ears ringing from 20 minutes of continuous combat. Then he popped the canopy, climbed out onto the wing, and looked up at the sky where the German fighters were circling. They watched him. He watched them. And then, slowly, Oberstleutnant Stigler's formation turned east and headed back to Berlin. Johnson stood in that frozen field, alone, alive. until a British patrol found him 3 hours later, half frozen but breathing, suffering from nothing worse than frostbite and exhaustion. "You're a long way from home, Yank," the British sergeant said. "What happened?" Johnson looked at the wreckage of his Mustang, at the empty ammunition boxes, at the battle damage that stitched across the fuselage like scars. "I got lost," he said quietly. "The final count, verified by gun camera footage and German loss records recovered after the war, was 8 confirmed kills, 3 probables, and 2 damaged aircraft that crashed on landing. 13 Luftwaffe fighters destroyed or permanently disabled in 20 minutes of continuous combat by a single pilot flying a single aircraft." The Congressional Medal of Honor citation, presented to Johnson by General Eisenhower 4 months later, used words like extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, but those words couldn't capture what Johnson had actually done. They couldn't describe the impossible mathematics he'd overcome, or the tactical innovations he'd employed, or the simple fact that he'd taken a fight the experts said couldn't be won and won it anyway through nothing more than skill and stubborn refusal to die. After the war, the Fighter Weapons School analyzed the engagement for months. They interviewed Johnson, they studied the gun camera footage. They ran simulations trying to recreate his maneuvers. And their final report concluded with a sentence that said, "Everything, this engagement represents the extreme outer limit of what a single pilot in a single aircraft can achieve against superior numbers. It should not be used as a tactical model because it cannot be replicated." But Johnson never claimed to be special. When reporters asked him how he'd survived, he would just shrug and say, "I got lucky. The Germans made mistakes." "What mistakes?" they would press. "They thought I was trying to survive," Johnson said. "I wasn't. I was just trying to kill as many of them as possible before I died." Turns out, when you stop worrying about living, you're a lot harder to kill. There's a photograph taken in May 1945 that shows Johnson standing next to a new P-51 at an airfield in England. The war in Europe had ended 6 days earlier. In the photograph, Johnson is smiling, but his eyes carry a weight that wasn't there in earlier pictures, the burden of being a man who'd faced impossible odds and survived when hundreds of thousands hadn't. He flew 33 more combat missions before Germany surrendered, shot down 6 more Luftwaffe fighters, earned the Distinguished Service, Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart for wounds suffered when flak, shrapnel, punctured his oxygen system over Munich. But he never fought alone against 50 aircraft again. The generals made sure of that. After the February 6th engagement, 8th Air Force. Policy changed. No fighter would be permitted to engage more than 8 enemies without support. Johnson's tactics were studied, analyzed, incorporated into training manuals, but with a warning that they represented the absolute limits of aircraft performance and human capability. The P-51D Mustang that Johnson flew that day, tail number 44 to 14,237, Betty Lou, never flew again.
The damage from the belly landing was too severe. The aircraft was scrapped in 1946, cut apart and melted down, transformed from a weapon into plowshares and automobiles and all the peaceful machinery of a world that no longer needed fighters. But before they destroyed it, the crew chief who'd warned Johnson about his unauthorized modifications walked out to where the Mustang sat in the salvage yard. He looked at the scorched gun ports, at the empty ammunition boxes, at the belly damage and the sheared landing gear, and he did something that wasn't in any regulation. He painted 8 small swastikas beneath the cockpit, right next to the 27 Johnson had painted before. 35 kills total, 8 of them in 20 minutes. The crew chief stepped back and looked at his work. Then he saluted the broken aircraft. "You were right, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "That trigger worked just fine." Johnson survived the war, returned to Ohio, and lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to those 20 minutes over Berlin. He worked as a commercial pilot, flew for WWII, taught aerobatics to students who never knew their soft-spoken instructor had once faced down 50 enemy fighters and won. He died in 1997, at the age of 74, of natural causes. At his funeral, 7 men attended whom Johnson had never met, German pilots who'd been in Stigler's formation that day, who'd flown across the Atlantic to pay their respects to the American who'd given them the fight of their lives and then been granted mercy by their commander. One of them, Otto Klein's younger brother Hans, who'd also been a Luftwaffe pilot, gave a brief eulogy. "Your brother shot down my brother," he told Johnson's widow, "but he did it in honorable combat, and my brother died as a warrior. And then your husband, with no ammunition and no fuel, was allowed to live by our commander because Oberstleutnant Stigler recognized that he too was a warrior. This is how war should be fought, with courage and honor and mercy.
Your husband embodied all three. The church was silent except for the sound of old men crying, remembering a morning when the sky over Berlin had been filled with tracer fire and burning aircraft and one American pilot who refused to accept the mathematics that said he should already be dead. In the end, what Robert Johnson did over Berlin wasn't about the kill count or the medal citations or the tactical innovations that made it into the training manuals. It was about the choice he made when faced with impossible odds, the decision that survival was less important than making the enemy pay for every inch of sky, that going down fighting was better than running, that sometimes the only way to win is to stop trying to win and just focus on the fight itself. That's the lesson the manuals can't teach and the simulations can't capture. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. That sometimes the mathematically impossible becomes possible simply because someone refuses to accept the statistics. That one person, in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of skill and determination and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, can change the outcome of a battle that was already lost. Robert Johnson proved that on a frozen February morning in 1945, 32,000 feet above a city that doesn't exist anymore, in a war that ended 78 years ago. He proved it with 8 confirmed kills, 1,200 rounds of ammunition, and 20 minutes that defied every probability calculation the experts could create. He proved it by looking at 50 enemy aircraft and deciding that the only thing that mattered was making them remember him. And when the fuel ran out and the ammunition was gone and the engine died, he still brought his aircraft down in a frozen field and walked away. Because sometimes survival isn't about following the manual or playing the odds or doing the smart, rational thing. Sometimes it's about being too stubborn to die, too skilled to be killed, and too determined to quit, even when quitting is the only logical option. The sky over Berlin is quiet now. The contrails have faded. The fighters that fell that day are buried in salvage yards or forgotten in frozen fields, their atoms scattered into a peaceful world that bears no resemblance to the one they fought in. But the lesson remains, passed from one generation of pilots to the next, that the limits we accept, the impossibilities we acknowledge, the odds we refuse to challenge, are often wrong. That sometimes, very rarely, the right answer is to push the throttle forward and dive into the center of the storm, not because you think you'll survive, but because the mission requires it, and survival is secondary to getting the job done. Robert Bob Johnson understood that, and on February 6, 1945, he proved it beyond any doubt. To explore more untold World War II legends, subscribe to After the Last Shot and join us in remembering history like never before.